Okay. So, but what's interesting out of this group, right now, there are a couple of cases that are going through the court systems. In this group, there is a case that is made it up through the court systems and where I am an expert witness. And I can't disclose anything about these cases because of where they are in their lawsuits. But they were able to, based off our preliminary scans, and we have a methodology. You do a preliminary scan, you get medical imaging, any toxicology reports that can go along with this to substantiate higher levels of metals in you. These were all in the protocol, and then finally with where you go in what's called an anechoic chamber, and it's a very sophisticated Faraday cage in simple terms, but it blocks off huge frequency spectrums. And you bring these individuals in there, and then you do a frequency counter, and you can detect a signal in those areas that we did find emissions in the preliminary RF scans.
So that means
So
you put them into a device similar to the Faraday cage, and then you do a RF scan and you find that the source of emission from inside of the human body.
there in the anechoic chamber, yes, it blocks off those frequencies from coming in, but they are emitting it. And here's the interesting thing: those from the United States all had similar frequency. Those in Europe had a different similar frequency. Those in Russia had a different frequency. Those in China, those in Korea. So that was an interesting finding that we've concluded. And I believe I gave you a copy of our phase 3 scanning report, and you can see the data that was found there. But yes. So also I forgot to mention that that gentleman that I had come up in the middle of the room, who was a military subcontractor, was working on the AIDS virus. And so one would question, why is the military working on the AIDS virus? A lot of anecdotal information was coming over my experience. Now, this experience happened over, it was over a decade of doing this. I've now, up until recently, I sort of took a back door and just started doing my own research and working on some other topics. And this is why I became a hypnotherapist. I have been practicing hypnotherapy, or hypnosis, I should say, since the early 2000s. And when I started to see this phenomenon and why it's important that society is educated, because education is the first step in combating this. Initially, if you can imagine being your average person and you wake up one morning and you're hearing these strange sounds, you're going, what's going on? You're not feeling well. And you go wow, if I go tell my doctor this, I don't know what my doctor is going to say to me. He's just going to put me on medication. But that was the worst thing possible for these people, because it just re-victimizes them once again. Now, what are we finding? You have some images there. There are a couple cases that we can talk about the history and flow of this. There was a gentleman by the name of James Walbert who was successful in obtaining a restraining order. He found out that he was implanted, and they found an implant in his scapula area through an MRI scan. They ended up doing some further toxicology reports and found higher levels of metal in his body, unusual metals in his body. And
who did the implant? Did they find out?
He got the restraining order against who he believed did the implant. And the judges felt that there was enough circumstantial evidence to at least give the order. He believes it was someone who was trying to, if I recall this correctly, trying to steal information about an invention that he was working on.
Okay.
And that's what his complaint was. But the circumstantial story that was going around to me is irrelevant. What's more relevant is the fact that number one, you can see it in a medical study. B, number two, you have toxicology reports and medical reports to substantiate his claim. And number three, you have a judge who believed in enough in the circumstantial evidence to issue the order. So that was important there. But prior to James Walbert, there was another case down in Southern California by a gentleman by the name of David Larson. He is a politician at the time, and he was having unusual symptoms, electric shocks, basically everything that you see here. And he ended up filing a lawsuit against a medical company down in Southern California. And what they had found is that he had these implants, many of them. It was over 10 implants that were implanted throughout his body. Now, you have pictures there, and you can pull up the Dave Larson report. And when you look at the images, and this is the scary part, when you think about how far technology has come, these implants back in the 40s and 50s that the military was working on, and we got this information through the Freedom of Information Act, were about the size of a grain of rice. Now, if you look at the images, and this is over a decade ago, what was pulled out of Dave Larson, they were the size of the number of the date on a penny. Now they're even smaller than this. How do I know this? So when I was in Virginia, my wife went to school with a gentleman who was a typical overachiever. And he happened to work for the Pentagon. He was a military subcontractor, and he hadn't seen my wife since college, so he asked us to come stay with him in his house or visit them. And when he asked why we were there, I had mentioned briefly, not give him all the details about why we were there. I was invited to come and speak to everyone. And he had said, oh, well, we can tell you, depending on the implant, what year that they were being used. He goes, but now, if you're implanted, you're pretty much out of luck. He said they are so small now that not even medical imagery can detect these. So hence, the only way to detect this is through technology mechanisms. And hence, this is why we use the RF scanning procedures in order to initially detect these.
So what would be his theory of who originally put the implants in the people? Like who is that the military, or is this who did this?
Okay, well, there's a mixture. Some of them are medical facilities. Some are agencies that are hired by our government for research. And we do have a case like the Bob Boyce case. Bob Boyce was an inventor of a high efficiency engine, and he had a business partner. And when I spoke to Bob, Bob had terminal cancer, and he thought he said to me, he goes, Jesse, I had succumbed that I was going to die. But he said he was inside a Faraday cage, and because he was testing for RF leakage in the Faraday cage for his devices, and because he was detecting a leak and he didn't know where it was coming from. But by accident, the wand passed by his shoulder and it pinged. And so that was curious to him. So he went and got an X-ray, and in that X-ray, you could see a microchip that was in the tumor. And
the microchip in the tumor?
In the tumor, a microchip in the tumor, And you have images of those actual medical imagery that was done in that file. And what he had done then is they went and had surgery, pulled the tumor out. They had the microchip. It went to pathology.